Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience from Harvard University, where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neuroscience of behavior. And before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to parse and translate the information guests share on the show. And in addition to the podcast, I write long-form content and send out a free weekly newsletter at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. I also offer private, science-based health consulting, where we work one-on-one and apply the same rigorous, evidence-first approach you hear on the podcast, but personalized. We can obtain and analyze your biomarkers, work on diet and behavior strategies, review supplements and drugs that you might be taking, or anything else related to general metabolic health. So if you'd like more tailored guidance on your personal health, head to nickjikomes.com and fill out a short form or book time with me there. A great way to support my content in all of its forms is simply to visit mindandmatter.substack.com. You'll find a link to that in the episode description, and you'll also find a link to my current affiliate partners through my support page. These are products that I use myself that relate to physical, metabolic, or mental health. For example, one product I use every day is the Chiu water filter, which removes heavy metals, microbes, endocrine disruptors, you name it, so that you have higher quality drinking water. All of those links for health consulting, for my affiliate partners, and the Substack page are all in the episode description. So thank you very much for listening, and don't forget to check out mindandmatter.substack.com for all of my content. Professor Isaac Chiu, thank you very much for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here, Nick.
Do you want to start off by just telling everyone a little bit about who you are and what your lab does?
Sure. So I am a professor at Harvard Medical School, and my lab is in the Department of Immunology. And we actually study crosstalk between the brain, the nervous system, and the immune system. We're very interested in this bidirectional crosstalk between these systems in different aspects of inflammation and medicine. So we're interested in how this impacts pain and itch, which are two sensations we all are familiar with, and also how the nerve system actually affects the immune response. So how does it affect our ability to fight infections, and also how this also might impact diseases where inflammation is a big part of the disease, like skin inflammation, dermatitis, or gut inflammation, colitis. So I'm a neuroimmunologist, if you want to call me any specific term.
Yeah, and I think your research in particular is a really nice illustration of the fact that, on the one hand, as humans and as scientists, we like to make distinctions. We like to draw boundaries between things, and that's a necessary part of learning and understanding things, and it can be very convenient, even for just talking about them. But we have immunology textbooks, and then we have separate nervous system textbooks, and even within any given domain, right? We like to separate pain and itch. We like to separate the somatosensory system from the visual or other systems. And there are distinctions to be made there, to be sure, but also this is biology, and the boundaries can be fuzzy, and there's a lot of crosstalk, and a lot of things that we once maybe thought were separate or discrete or completely compartmentalized actually aren't. And there's a lot of overlap and blurry lines and fuzzy boundaries, if you will. So yeah, what have you, just at a high level, how did you sort of get into the realm of neuroimmunology yourself? And how is this sort of the interface between these two fields changed over the last few years?
So I think you gave a great introduction to my field of neuroimmunology, because I think traditionally these two systems were studied separately, right, as separate entities. But like you said, biology developed through evolution, not because say the brain is the brain and the immune system is the immune system, but the functions evolved in a common way. For example, both, an organism needs to be able to fight infections, right? And the brain actually, or the nervous system in primitive organisms like the C. elegans actually is used to sense essentially harmful bacteria versus helpful ones, right? So the discrimination is not just immune cells that help discriminate what's good or bad. And similarly, things that we think neurons use, like neurotransmitters or things like that have actually been used by immune cells to communicate as well. So what we think about as like, okay, this is an immune molecule or this is a function of the nervous system or immune system traditionally, actually there's roles for the other cell type in that or other system in that function. So I personally got interested in this partly because as an undergraduate, I was at Harvard College. I was fascinated both by both subjects. I actually thought these were the two coolest systems, the most complex. Both have memory and complex components, and actually, it was in my undergrad research lab. I was in Professor Jack Strominger's lab. He's one of the leaders in immunology who discovered MHC molecules. He said, Isaac, you should think about the brain because recently, at that time, it was early 2000s, the molecules he discovered, which were involved in the immune system, were also found in the brain. Work from Carlos Schatz's lab showed that MHC actually was involved in memory and long-term potentiation. So I said, well, there has to be something fascinating that's connecting these two systems. And so I decided after undergrad to pursue PhD in immunology, but in that process, learn about neuroimmunology. So how does the immune system act in the nervous system in the context of neurological diseases and so this kind of theme of the two systems has always been in my interest. And what is exciting is seeing that indeed now the whole field of these two fields are really interested in each other because it's very clear that they're intimately communicating.
Yeah, and I think naively one might think, okay, when I get an infection or I'm injured, that's a problem that the immune system handles. The bacteria come in, the immune system does all of the sensing and handles the problem. And maybe the nervous system is affected by that in some way as kind of an innocent bystander. But that's not really how it works. The immune system is involved. The immune system is detecting the pathogen, but so is the nervous system. And actually, sort of the communication is bidirectional with each component here. The infection or the injury is going to directly interact with neurons in the nervous system and immune cells in the immune system. And then the neurons and the immune cells are going to communicate in both directions. And so again, there's bidirectional communication across the board here. And we're going to get into that with what you've discovered and some of the stuff that you work on. Let's give people a basic sense for how some of the key nuts and bolts of your work on the nervous system side with respect to pain sensation. And I guess the cue that I'll give people is obviously we feel pain if we get like a bump or a bruise or a cut, but as everyone can probably sympathize, we also get pain signals when we get infections and things like this. So we'll connect the dots here for people, but just on the pain sensation side, when I feel pain in my periphery, in my body somewhere, what are the neurons that are actually responsible for sensing the initial steps in that pain process?
This is a great question, Nick. So the pain is sensed. Pain actually is an unpleasant sensation, right? That our brain processes. But the initial step that initiates pain is called nociception. So the detection of potentially noxious, harmful stimuli. And there are specialized nerves or sensory neurons that innervate our skin, our joints, our GI tract that can be tuned to these harmful things. So for example, heat or cold, extreme cold temperatures, or something like you said, tissue injury, something that's forceful. These nerves have abilities or receptors on their surface that can detect these specific noxious stimuli, and that induces firing of nerves through action potentials and ion channels that are like, for example, what's called trip channels. But in the context of inflammation or infection, what we found is that these nerves can also directly sense pathogens and what they secrete. So a bacterial pathogen secretes things that could damage tissues, like a toxin. We found a particular bacteria, Staph aureus, which is one of the most common types of bacteria that infects our skin, secretes a toxin which acts on these sensory neurons, these nociceptor sensory neurons, and it causes them to start firing because that toxin pokes holes in the membrane of the nerves. So this is just one example where the nerves sense directly a bacteria, which you might think the immune system would need to combat, right? And why do we think that's important? Is because, well, neurons have some advantages in terms of mediating host defense. They respond immediately within seconds, right? Or at least within minutes of detecting something. The immune system will take several longer than that. It might take hours, right,
Right,
to be
right.
recruited to that site. So your neuron detecting that bacteria might be able to coordinate the host response to defend against a pathogen faster than actually traditional immune cells. In fact, one of their roles could be to modulate the immune cells that come in, right? Um, Another reason is that actually some of these neuronal reflexes that help us, we think about expelling things that are harmful, may also help us fight against the pathogen. So you think about things like itch, right, where you're scratching the surface. Maybe that is some way to get rid of things on the surface of our skin. Or coughing, right? Coughing is something that's activated by nociceptors that reside in our vagus nerve. And that reflex can help get rid of something harmful. Vomiting, these kind of reflexes that are, I would say, generally nociceptive in nature, are also activated when we're sick, right? Because that might help us remove something that's harmful in a much bigger way than maybe the immune response can do locally, right? So I think that so the coupling of these sensory nerves that mediate pain or other noxious sensations to infection, I think evolutionarily evolved for that reason.
Yeah, yeah. So nociceptors, so neurons that are nociception neurons, they're
Mhm.
detecting a potentially problematic stimulus. It might be causing a problem right now, or it might be causing a future problem, like an infection that's nascent and just getting started. But through mechanisms we don't necessarily need to unpack completely, they can detect the pressure that comes with a cut. They can
Mhm.
detect the heat that comes with burning yourself on the stove. And as you said, they can actually detect the presence of pathogens. They can detect molecules secreted from or on the surface of bacteria or whatever. That is sort of like an immune, that's like, you would think of that as being an immune system thing. And indeed, the immune cells do detect those things, but some of these nociceptor neurons do as well. So, in other words, the same neurons in the periphery that detect pressure pain and itching and other noxious pain, they're also directly detecting things like pathogens. So that they're right from the start, they sort of the immune side of things is built right into the nervous system.
That's correct. And I think so that, and in terms of a broader point, right? Like we need to fight things that are harmful or dangerous, and pathogens are one of the leading things that organisms have to deal with, right? Mammals have to deal with, and so having neurons be able to detect things from the cell wall of a bacteria, like lipopolysaccharide, or toxins, like I mentioned, I think makes a lot of sense evolutionarily. And then, the sensation of pain also is protective in the sense that you then avoid putting pressure on that area, right? So that you have a wound or infected wound, you may want to leave that area alone to allow not just the immune system to come in to clear the pathogens, but also wound healing afterwards, right? So pain is a protective response. And acutely, if we don't have pain, this is a big problem because you'll injure yourself, right? You can also cause, like, there are people who have congenital insensitivities to pain because they have mutations in specific ion channels. And they often don't live very long because they get into accidents or they have, issues with that. And so I think acute pain is absolutely critical for us to be able to survive as organisms, as mammals, and then to be able to couple that to inflammation or sickness, I think makes sense as well because it might induce behavioral changes as well as cellular changes that might help facilitate our ability to fight pathogens.
Yeah. And, something that comes to mind here that is an interesting common denominator between the immune system, the immune cells per se, and the nervous system is plasticity and the ability to change and adapt. This happens in immune cells. They can form memories and change themselves. This happens in neurons as well. What, can you maybe start to talk about examples where you get sick or you get an injury, the animal, has some immune problem it has to take care of. It's infected with a pathogen that causes some amount of pain. So the immune system and the nervous system are both involved at different levels and in different ways, but there's constant crosstalk there. But then there has to be some sort of memory of that injury or that infection. And we can probably, I'll let you steer us into a particular like example that gets into this, but we all have probably examples of we got sick or we got injured. And maybe if you're used to a certain type of injury, right? Like you're a football player or whatever, you sort of get used to the pain and it's not as painful anymore. So you become desensitized to the pain. But on the flip side, you can also become sensitized to pain. You can become more sensitive to a painful stimulus. And there are instances where this is adaptive and you kind of learn how to deal with something better because it's not going to kill you. So you don't need to like freak out. But also where it's maladaptive, where you become hypersensitive to pain after an infection or injury, and it gets in the way of life. So on the general topic of, I guess, plasticity and how the sensation of pain can change in an experience-dependent manner, what are some examples of how that change actually happens?
This is a great, very good, important question, actually, because like you mentioned, the memory system, right, of this peripheral nervous system is actually called sensitization. This idea that, some stimulus, it could be inflammation or injury, makes that neuron, which in the beginning took, let's say, a large amount of force or heat to induce that pain. Then later on, you only need to have a small amount of force or the same temperature to activate that nerve. And we've experienced this, right? For example, if you, just as a simple example, if you get a sunburn, so there's been inflammation there on the skin, and then you go take a shower that normally feels, like it's just a normal temperature, now feels like so hot and burning, right?
Right,
So
right.
those nerves in the skin have now been sensitized. So they're going to fire much easier with a smaller stimulus. And this is actually, in terms of a term, there's this term allodynia, which means normally innocuous touch or cold or heat causing now a dynia, a painful response. And how does that work? So there are multiple ways by which a nerve can be sensitized. One is that actually signaling pathways within the nerve terminal causes ion channels to be modulated. So I mentioned these, for example, trip channels, which detect like the chili pepper component that's in chili peppers that causes that burning sensation. This one called TRPV1. This ion channel also senses heat. But when there's inflammation, there's signaling pathways that from other receptors, for example, from a cytokine receptor, that once it detects a cytokine, then leads to the phosphorylation or change in this ion channel so that now it opens easier. So the next time you stimulate it with heat, it will open faster and easier. Just as a side, like TRPV1 was a very important ion channel because it was the first one to be discovered that detects a noxious stimuli. And that was discovered by David Julius at UCSF. And he won a Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine 2021 based on that discovery. So these ion channels can be modified by inflammation, and now they're opening easier, right? But there are also other ways by which peripheral sensitization could occur. For example, the neuron themselves in the skin or in these other tissues might change their innervation pattern. Like you mentioned, plasticity, right? So maybe the nerve now sprouts into the tissue so that there are more branches and more fibers that can detect the stimulus. And that's another, the question is how does, for example, do immune cells make things that cause them to sprout, or do injured tissues release growth factors? And then also there's, of course, a lot of changes molecularly at the transcriptional level within these nerves. So they might turn on genes or change their expression of genes that relate to pain. So then, so you need to have this response, like I said earlier, to avoid further injury, right? Maybe the sensitization is adaptive in the sense of during the course of wound healing, you want to avoid touching that area or putting pressure there. However, there has to be resolution of pain, right? Actually, more broadly, there has to be resolution of inflammation. And this is a very important aspect of actually the immune system as well as the nervous system. Like once that process has been going because of you got an infection or you got injury, you have to be able to turn that down after the healing process, right? However, many people have maladaptive pain, so chronic pain. And by definition, chronic pain is anything that lasts longer than 3 months after the initial injury that, with healing, that should go away. But these people still experience, whether it is, chronic back pain or chronic nerve injury induced pain. And part of that big question is why that occurs and how do we shut down those nerves that are now overly sensitized? And so it's a big question in the pain field, developing ways of blocking sensitization. And we think, at least our lab and many others also thinks one of the components that drives that long-term pain could be overactive immune cells because they produce factors like cytokines or mediators that can cause the nerves to keep being sensitized. Um,
Yeah.
right. So the classic example actually of what an immune cell could make that causes a neuron to or induces pain or causes is prostaglandins.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that we all at some point probably took a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, right? NSAIDs, and these block actually they act by blocking prostaglandins, so like ibuprofen or
Right, right. And as many listeners might know, because I've covered some of this biology quite a bit.
Mhm.
So prostaglandins are basically a type of fat. They're a fat, omega-6
Mhm.
polyunsaturated fat derived lipid, and they are inflammatory. So these are common when we have like injuries and stuff. Prostaglandins are a major piece of the inflammation and the pain and like that side of it.
That's right, exactly. So that's and when we eat certain types of foods that have a lot of omega-6 fatty acids, or versus omega-3 fatty acids, right? So the balance of prostaglandin production versus pro-resolving mediators might be out of balance. But definitely prostaglandins are made by many immune cells like macrophages and cells that come into tissues when there's injury and they release the prostaglandins which then act on the nerves and make them decrease that firing threshold that I mentioned earlier, right? So they're more easily able to be activated and cause pain. So I mean, prostaglandins are part of the equation, right? But there are many other factors that immune cells make that nerves can sense, which just shows how intimate these two systems are connected. So
Yeah.
this language, so whether it's prostaglandins or cytokines, or immunologists have studied cytokines for a long time. The certain cytokines have been linked to autoimmune diseases like IL-17, or certain cytokines might cause gut inflammation like TNF alpha. Well, it turns out these cytokines, their receptors are also on the nociceptive neurons. So they can detect these cytokines, and then that also signals within the neurons to upregulate pain. And I think that it could be context dependent, right? So certain conditions of chronic pain or inflammation-induced pain is caused by certain types of cytokines.
Yeah.
So we need
Yeah.
to understand which ones are being produced in each of these situations to block them.
Yeah. And sort of at all levels here, right? Balance is key, or homeostasis is key. You want inflammation to turn on when you need it and where you need it, but then you want it to turn off when it's no longer needed. You want your nociceptors to be activated so that you feel pain, so that you don't touch the inflamed tissue and mess up the wound healing process. But then you want to turn it off after the problem has been
That's
handled.
correct. Yes.
And sort of this concept of balance arises at multiple levels. You can talk about imbalances between, as you said, omega-6 and omega-3 fats, which might cause imbalances between inflammatory lipids like prostaglandins and resolving lipids like some other ones we could talk about. You might talk about the balance between different immune cells, different white blood
Mhm.
cells and T cells that we
Mhm.
might talk about, that, they can be imbalanced so that they're a little bit too aggressive or a little bit under aggressive. And then you can talk about balance at the level of the pain neurons, right? You want sensitization to go up and to go down in a way that's appropriate for the context, but not to get stuck in one configuration. And sort of, you said, basically, when we think about things like chronic pain or chronic inflammation, what we mean there is the inflammation and or the pain are lasting too long. They're showing up at inappropriate times or places because there's some kind of underlying imbalance of some kind or another.
That's correct. Yes. So I think that you're exactly right. So actually, I also want to point out that inflammation, which we usually think about as, tissue, redness and things. Well, pain is actually part of inflammation. It was defined by 2000 years ago, actually, inflammation, this term came up, and it was defined by this Roman physician called Celsus as having four signs, of which one is pain. The other three are redness, heat, and swelling, right? So pain, like you said, pain is part of inflammation. It's always been part of inflammation, and it needs to have that proper kinetics where it gets induced acutely. That helps protect us, but then it is resolved. And the body's ability to resolve inflammation and pain is a really key area of research. And I want to highlight a bit of how in immunology, this has really also a key part. And maybe the things that we're learning in the immune system could also be applied to pain and the nervous system. So there are special T cells called regulatory T cells, which so T cells are a branch of the immune system, the adaptive immune system, right? So we know that we need T cells to induce an immune response against infections and pathogens, but also, different branches of the different types of T cells promote different types of inflammation. But there's a specialized one called regulatory T cells that then shut down all of these other T cells, right? And they produce cytokines like IL-10 or other, TGF beta. These actually shut down the ability of other cytokines to work. And they're very important to resolve the immune response, right? So they were discovered, and now people are trying to harness them to treat autoimmune diseases. And so, that discovery also won the Nobel Prize. Tregs were this last year, actually. Actually, yeah, just 2 days last week, there was a symposium here at Harvard, which the winner of the Nobel Prize, Sakaguchi, who discovered Tregs, was here giving a talk. But I want to bring that up because there's also been recent papers showing that regulatory T cells might be harnessed to block pain. And that's really interesting because they produce not just IL-10, but also endogenous opioid peptides, proenkephalin, which is the peptide precursor to opioids. And so if they're there next to a pain fiber, they actually secrete things that shut the pain down. Right. So you could also not only shut down the immune response there, but also block that pain. So people are trying to see if we can direct Tregs into areas to treat pain as well.
Yeah, so let's talk about some examples of neuroimmune communication, some concrete examples, and talk about some of the neuropeptides that you study, like CGRP and others. And I'll let you choose the specific examples here. But what people should imagine is if we talk about, say, an infection, a pathogen like a bacteria gets into an animal, there's going to be communication from the pathogen to the immune cells and vice versa, from the pathogen to neurons like nociceptor, pain or noxious detecting neurons, and vice versa. And then also between the neurons and the immune cells in both directions. So you can pick the example here, but let's say you get a bacterial infection, the animal has to deal with it somehow. How is that infection initially detected by the nociceptor neurons? And what does some of that communication start to look like between the nociceptor neuron and the pathogen, and then the neuron and the immune cells that will get called in?
Yeah, this is a great so this is definitely at the heart of what my lab studies. We're really interested in what molecules the neurons produce that could affect the immune system and vice versa, as well as what are they sensing from pathogens. So you mentioned neuropeptides, and neuropeptides are really important in this communication. So neuropeptides are peptides that are actually used by neurons to communicate. Classically, think about that in the brain, how they communicate with other neurons. But there are many types of neuropeptides. One called CGRP, calcitonin gene-related peptide, which is highly expressed in pain-related neurons, CGRP. Another one called substance P. So these are two of the best known neuropeptides that nociceptor neurons produce. And it turns out that the neuropeptides, their receptors, which again, was first discovered in the brain, are also expressed on immune cells. So these neuropeptides can act directly on immune cells. And so it depends on the type of immune cell, but the action of neuropeptides during infection could have various effects. So we found, which is somewhat surprising actually, that in several types of infection, for example, infection caused by strep pyogenes, the pathogen that causes strep throat. So when you think of it that, when we get this really painful infection when we were young, but also it causes really very terrible bacterial infections of the skin. For example, necrotizing fasciitis, which is flesh-eating disease, extremely painful. Well, it turns out that in that type of infection, it causes the nociceptors to be activated, and then they release CGRP. They release them from the nerve terminal. So they're actually stored in these dense core vesicles, which are at the endings of these nerves. And as soon as they're activated, they release these CGRP out into the tissues. And then we found that they act on neutrophils. Neutrophils are really important immune cells that actually come and eat bacteria. So they're circulating in the blood. They're kind of like our army of white blood cells. They're some of the most abundant immune cells. When you have an infection, they rush into the tissues to try to fight the bacteria, right? So they're also the ones that produce pus. Like when they die, what pus is like neutrophils fighting bacteria. So
yeah, it's like when you go to the battlefield after the battle's over, it's all of the dead bodies on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. Our immune cells have sacrificed themselves, but at the end, that's good because they've also killed the bacteria. But we found almost a little bit counterintuitively that CGRP, the nociceptor-derived neuropeptide, actually shuts down the ability of these neutrophils to kill bacteria. They block their ability to clear bacteria as well as block their recruitment into the tissues. So this is actually a really bad thing, right? Because if you block these neutrophils, then the bacteria can then expand and grow more. And so
you would not want to release a bunch of CGRP early in an infection. You'd want to maybe use it as a turn off signal later on or something.
Yes, exactly. So you've hit the nail on the head. So it turns out that CGRP we think is actually not just my work, but other labs have found that it's quite important in inducing that tissue healing, wound healing part, which is part of resolution of tissue injury. So if it's on too early, it actually suppresses the type of immune response that you need to fight the bacteria. So the bacteria in this case hijacked this neuropeptide for its advantage. And we've seen similar roles of this also when we have brain infections. So meningitis is a really horrible type of bacterial infection that is life-threatening. So bacteria in the meninges, which is the outer part of it's a wrapping outside the brain. Actually, there are lots of pain fibers there. And these nerves are activated by the bacteria. They produce CGRP, which then again shuts down these neutrophils. So then the bacteria can get through that meninges into our brain. So we found, I think this was surprising, but also it gave us a therapeutic angle. So there are now really good drugs that people are using to actually block CGRP. So CGRP has been shown to really be a key mediator of migraine headaches. And so there are multiple drugs on the market right now that target either neutralize CGRP, the neuropeptide, or block the receptor called RAMP1. And so we found if we took these drugs and gave them to animals that were infected with either necrotizing fasciitis bacteria or meningitis bacteria, this actually boosts the neutrophil response and helps the mice survive.
I see. So hold on, let's back up for a second. CGRP is a neuropeptide. It's a peptide released from neurons. Right. It's affecting the immune system. It is basically turning down the neutrophil response and turning it down. So there are infections you can get like necrotizing fasciitis, where if I'm hearing you correctly, the bacteria is sort of turning up the CGRP response so that the immune system is not called in, and therefore the infection is more robust and it spreads and it takes root. And so again, CGRP is a neuropeptide, but it's sort of suppressing the immune system, basically.
That's correct. That's correct. So, I was telling you earlier about how nociceptors detecting pathogens might be beneficial for us, but in this case, it's actually the pathogen which is exploiting this system for its advantage. So the pain fiber shutting down neutrophils is definitely harmful in these situations where the bacteria are the main cause of damage, and you really need neutrophils to kill them. But there are also counterexamples, which this is then why we think the system is there, where actually the immune response or overactive immune response is actually what kills you as the host. So one salient example of that is influenza infections. So when you have a flu, very severe lung infections caused by viruses like COVID-19 or flu, it's not necessarily the virus itself that damages your lung. It's actually the overactive immune system.
Right, right. The immune response is too strong, and the collateral damage is basically so great that you destroy yourself.
Yes, exactly. And that's where we found that the same nociceptive neurons actually are required for the host to survive because they shut down this same cell type, neutrophils. Neutrophils, in the flu context, they come in and they're not protective because, first of all, they don't really do that much in killing flu. But in fact, they damage the lung. So if you have now these neurons that are activated, they shut down neutrophils. That helps you suppress or resolve the inflammation in a way that allows
Yeah,
you to survive. So,
yeah.
yeah,
And this is so, of course, we need to talk about these things one at a time, but it's always
yes.
a complex mixture and cocktail of signals that is regulating what's happening in our tissues. So, CGRP is one peptide that needs to go up and down in the right way so that the
Hmm.
immune system is not over or underactivated at the right phase of the infection,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
When the infection is manifesting and growing, you want to call in the troops to deal with it. But then as they do their job and they finish it, you want to turn that signal off. We talked about the prostaglandins earlier, right? When you
Mhm.
get a bruise or a bump or whatever, you want some of those inflammatory lipids to come in, but you also want them to go away. You don't want that inflammation to be chronic. So there's a balance. There's a balance between many different things at all
Yes.
phases of an infection or an injury process, and all of these things need to sort of wax and wane in the appropriate relative amounts to have a healthy response that doesn't turn into a pathological or chronic response. So CGRP is one example of a key player here. Can you say a little bit about? I just want to back up one more time before digging into that a little bit more. So, CGRP is a neuropeptide, a peptide released from neurons. Peptides are basically miniature proteins.
Hmm.
Of course, there's other molecules involved here, small molecules, bigger proteins, like they're all involved in different ways. But what are sort of the advantages or the uses of a peptide as a signal as opposed to other things? Are they faster or slower? Are they more specific
Hmm.
or less specific? What's nice about peptides as like a class of signaling molecules?
It's a great question. So, I'll contrast peptides to, let's say, a neurotransmitter. So, when we think about neurons that signal in the brain, we often think about classic neurotransmitters like, glutamate, acetylcholine, or adrenaline. So, these things are very small molecules and they are at the synapse, right? So, in the synapse, which are two nerves really, really close together, they're rapidly released and then they're rapidly acting on the next neuron, but they also degrade really quickly. So, um, peptides, on the other hand, are larger than these neurotransmitters that we think about. So they're more stable. They can be released and they can actually act a little bit more in the long distance, right? So you don't necessarily have to have a synapse, which is within really small distances between cells for a neuropeptide to act. Neuropeptides can diffuse in tissues. And that might be good in the sense of talking to immune cells or talking to blood vessels because they can diffuse and let's say also affect recruitment of these cells or affect signaling in a longer term, right? These signals don't degrade as much. And I mean, people are still trying to understand the logic of different neuropeptides. Actually, I mentioned too CGRP, substance P, but there are many other neuropeptides that sensory neurons make. In fact, I want to point out something that I didn't mention earlier. If you look at all sensory neurons that innervate our skin, and there's probably about 18 to 20 different types of these, and each of them express different types of neuropeptides and different types of receptors. So the complexity of sensation, whether it's pain or touch or itch, is still being understood. And each of these neuropeptides may have a different role in talking to tissue cells, right? It could be maybe one of them is talking very specifically to one type of immune cell, whereas others are more broadly active. So there's that advantage as well. They're longer lasting. They're maybe giving you a code of acting on their targets. I just want to highlight one interaction. So substance P is another neuropeptide that's not CGRP, right? Its receptor there's been only in the last few years a discovery of this, it's another name, MRGB2, only found in mast cells. Mast cells are a type of immune cell that are full of granules themselves. And substance P can really potently induce a mast cell to empty its contents, right? So mast cells produce things like histamine and other things.
Well,
like that.
When we talk about mast cells, we basically mean histamine. Yeah. So when people think about allergies and allergy medicine,
that's right.
Those are the cells we're talking about.
That's right, exactly. So you might think, okay, in some conditions, I want mast cells to be activated, but not, neutrophils. I don't want to affect neutrophils, right? Like CGRP. So there could be some logic of why certain neuropeptides are in certain nerves and only activated by certain stimuli, for example, during allergies. So that can amplify the allergic response. Whereas, when you have an infection, you don't necessarily want an allergic response, right? You have a different set of neural signals, neuropeptides that are released.
Yeah. And so again, just to hammer this home, we have to talk about these things one at a time, but it's not like the nociceptors release substance P or CGRP and that's it. It's not like the immune cells release prostaglandins and that's it. They're all releasing a complex cocktail of stuff, and it's the full mixture that determines the spatial and the temporal dynamics for how inflammation plays out. So it's like this really complex balance of things that interact with each other. And, we talk about them one at a time. These components are important individually, but we always have to remember that these things fit back into a really complex and dynamic soup of stuff.
Yes. I think that's the exciting thing, or maybe difficult thing of science, right? Is to understand the complexities in a real life situation, right? There's all these different types of mediators that are coming out of each neuron subtype, and then there are different immune cells which also produce other mediators. And I also want to point out the bacteria too. The bacteria have their own lots of things being produced, right? So I think there's the understanding this crosstalk between systems is fascinating. I think as a scientist, we tend to try to be reductionist. So we say, okay, we're going to look at our one interesting molecule and receptor, but we have to take it into context of all the complexities that you just mentioned, right? And I think in the course of infection, also there's, like you said, kinetic changes in each of these parts. The bacteria is also trying to adapt, right? They have evolved to avoid, each of these things. So they might make something that will target one type of nerve and one type of immune cell. And so that also adds another interesting level of complexity.
Yeah. And then sort of another topic of discussion here that I think is really interesting is the tuning or the appropriateness of the immune response and how the nervous system informs the immune system in terms of how it needs to come and deal with the problem, such as an infection. So let's say, again, you get an infection, a pathogen is taking root. You've got to call in the troops, but there's many different types of soldiers that can be in the army, and you want to call in, specific soldiers for specific problems, depending on the pathogen or if it's an injury, and so on and so forth. And, one way to talk about this is, right, there's many different types of white blood cells. There's many different types of T cells, regulatory T cells, other T cells, different subtypes. And every infection is going to, call in some of those cells and also cause them to change, right? The immune system is sort of dynamically changing and cells are transforming into different types in response to the particular pathogen or injury or problem that we're experiencing. Can you start to talk about maybe some examples of where an animal gets an infection, there's a pathogen, and then the neurons are communicating to the immune cells and sort of informing them about like how to develop, how to change, which soldiers need to be called in? How does that communication look like?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question, and I like that you've framed it that way, that the nervous system is ideally poised to coordinate the response, right? So I also want to talk maybe more broadly, the peripheral nervous system, right? Which is these pain nociceptors are part of that larger peripheral nervous system, has set up all these different neural circuits, right? That, for example, you have beyond sensory, you have sympathetic nerves that are part of our fight or flight response, or parasympathetic nerves that are, mediating other functions. We know from organ function, right? You have to have each of these branches coordinated to modulate, let's say, heart rate or modulate digestion. But the immune system is no exception. So it makes sense that the coordinated activation of different branches of the peripheral nervous system will induce different types of immune cells to come in or to leave in it, or to dampen those kind of immune cells. And this is, I have to confess, it's still early days. We're trying to understand how these different branches of the nervous system, including sensory neurons that produce CGRP, are affecting the immune response in different conditions. I wanted to highlight a study that we did, which was not an infection, but actually in the gut. We were interested in the gut-brain axis. So we did a very, I would say, agnostic type of experiment. So we said, okay, there are so many different nerves in the gut, right? There are ones that are coming from sensory neurons, like the pain fibers. There's also ones that come from the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that goes from the gut to the brainstem. And there's also neurons that sit in the gut itself, right? They're called enteric neurons. They cause us to have peristalsis. So what we did is scientifically, we took an approach called chemogenetics, where we can activate neurons using a synthetic molecule. And we activated 8 different types of neurons that innervate the gut. They're of different types. And we just said, what happens to the immune system? Like unbiased, we said, okay, well, we're going to activate them, each of these, and then just profile immune cells in the gut. And we've discovered things that were unexpected. Like, for example, this one type of neuron, when we activated them, cholinergic neurons, caused one type of immune cell to change in one part of the gut. There's kind of a matrix of like nerves controlling different immune cells. It turns out nociceptors, because that's the one that we really know the best, had the strongest effect. And it acted on multiple types of immune cells. So macrophages, which are phagocytic immune cells, changed, and also regulatory T cells, the Tregs that I mentioned to you earlier. One of the most striking changes was when we activated the pain fibers, nociceptors, the Treg population in the gut went down in number. So I told you that Tregs are important for controlling inflammation. Here, when we activated pain fibers or TRPV1 expressing nociceptors over the course of a week, or actually over a week, the Treg numbers went down. So maybe it's a counterbalancing effect where now you have chronic, so to speak, chronic pain. That signal actually decreases Tregs. So now inflammation will even go up. So I think it's extremely complex. We're still trying to understand how, the logic of all this, like why do certain nerves control certain immune cell types, how it's all, coordinated during inflammation or different conditions related to infection, but also autoimmune diseases, maybe cancer, things like that. So there's lots of really interesting interactions between these two systems that are still only starting to be understood.
Yeah, yeah. I think it could be useful to do a kind of compare and contrast of the gut, the gastrointestinal tract as a barrier and a surface, and the skin. So on the one hand, there's clear differences, right? That are sort of the intuitive differences, right? My skin's touching the outside world. My gut is dealing with food absorption and all of these things. But on the other hand, they're both barriers. They are both interfaces between the true internal world inside of ourselves and things from the external world, whether it's the skin directly in constant contact with the literal external physical world, or food, pathogens, stuff from the external world that we put into our mouth that goes through the GI tract. So there has to be a barrier there. It has to be selectively permeable. Stuff's got to get in, but not certain things. And obviously the nervous system has to innervate it. It has to talk to the barrier in different ways. And then of course the immune cells have to be there or be able to get there very easily because it is an interface, because it's also a site where pathogens can get in and so forth. What are some of the key similarities and differences between the skin and the gut as it relates to just being barriers of the body that need to be selective and highly regulated?
A great question. So these are two of my most favorite organs, right? So they're both highly exposed to the environment. But you're right that there are unique features, both in terms of the nervous system there as well as the immune system. So in the skin, we have a lot of nerves that can sense, mechanical stimuli to induce touch, right? Touch sensation. And there's also pain that we talked about, but also itch, right? So itch is, at least in terms of what we think about scratching, and itch is actually pretty specific to the skin, right? If you think about that sensation, it causes you to scratch the skin. So in terms of nerves, that's one thing, that there are only itch fibers in the skin. And maybe it's because we need to remove things that are at the surface before they get in, right? And then in terms of the gut, it's a mucosal surface in the classical sense. So it produces this term mucus, right? Which actually is a very important part of our barriers like the gut. So because the mucus lining separates the barrier, the epithelial cells, from things in the lumen of the gut, like, for example, bacteria that could be damaging that surface, right? So you need to separate. It's kind of like a fence, but it's really important how it's produced, like the composition and, whether that's regulating, homeostasis in the gut, right? So we actually found that nociceptors, pain fibers, induce mucus production. So they directly talk to cells called goblet cells, which are not in the skin, but in the gut. Goblet cells make mucus. So the neurons in the gut that actually express CGRP, this neuropeptide I mentioned,
Hmm.
CGRP directly acts on goblet cells. So as soon as you activate these nociceptors, these goblet cells start making mucus.
Hmm.
And experientially, actually, one of the things that we showed is that capsaicin, which is that active ingredient in chili peppers that causes
Yeah.
spiciness.
Yeah.
Capsaicin, if you give it to animals, it causes the immediate production of mucus, and it's
Mm.
because of CGRP and these neurons. So when you eat spicy foods, you start getting secretions,
Right,
right?
right, right. And is the basic idea here the body's detecting something that's potentially noxious, like a spicy
Mhm.
substance,
Yeah.
and the mucus is meant to neutralize it or trap it or prevent it from getting in?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. So it's preventing something potentially harmful, and it's usually coordinated too with something like motility, right? So the gut starts speeding up and
Right,
you
right.
make mucus. So this is actually, immunologists use this term weep and sweep. So you get rid of things by making production of secretions and then you sweep it out. And so it's another protective mechanism. I also want to point out the gut is very also unique in the sense that there's a huge amount of microbes that live there, right? There's the microbiota, of which many of them are actually good for us. They actually immune system. They help, produce metabolites that really help us with energy. And also the other unique thing is we eat our food, right? Food goes through the gut. So the gut has all these foreign things there, food and microbes, that our immune system has to tolerate. So it's called tolerance. So the gut is very complicated because you have to have, in fact, there's lots of Tregs in the gut, the regulatory T cells, because they cause our gut not to interact or overact, our immune system not to overact against food or against these bacteria, right? And so it's interesting to also think about how nerves there interact with each of these things, like the food that we eat or the bacteria that reside there. We know from the immune response that it's also quite different when you have and one of the things we're actually studying, and many people in the immunology field studying, is food allergies. Like when you have reaction against food, which is normally supposed to benefit us, how does that occur? Well, there's one theory that it's because the food first went through the skin when the child is young. Because when something goes through the skin, it's thought to be this is good, this is bad, right?
Right,
We
right,
have to
right.
have an immune response against it. So
Yeah.
there's evidence that, for example, kids who are exposed to peanut in some form, peanut oil is often found in
Right,
lotions.
right. Yeah, I was going to say, like,
Yeah.
food isn't just found in food. We have all of these things we've made, lotions, moisturizers, shampoos. We put them on our surface, but if they've got some food component in them, you're putting it through the skin route of entry as opposed to the gut route of entry. And as you're implying, like maybe the immune system therefore misrecognizes it.
Exactly. So there's this correlation between skin exposure to things early in life to the future development of food allergies. And so, and one of the things we're interested in is whether itching is part of that
Hmm.
process. So, when kids get eczema, which is a very common, or atopic dermatitis, very common skin disease in young kid or newborns, and they're scratching their skin, if that then is co-exposed with something, and we're
Right,
using egg white as a model allergen, but that then induces a very strong immune response.
right.
So maybe the skin barrier, by opening that barrier, now you start inducing immune response, and next time when it goes to the oral cavity, instead of tolerating that or oral tolerance, so to speak, now you're reacting against the food.
Right, right. And just,
Yeah.
it's hopefully pretty easy for people to think about what might happen here and why these things are so common. Like kids are going to itch scratches, they're going to open those wounds. That's now an entry point. And just think of all of the things that we put on our body,
Yes.
lotions, soaps, whatever. They got tens or even hundreds of components. And it's not too difficult to think like, okay, yeah, the peanut molecule in the moisturizer or the fruit or whatever component is in your skincare product can now get in and potentially be recognized as a pathogen, essentially, as something that needs to get rid of. And then the next time you eat a food, a literal food that has that same substance inside of it, you're now going to trigger an immune response. It's not too surprising to suppose that this has a lot to do with the increase in allergies and autoimmunity that we've seen over time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, unfortunately, my son developed severe nut allergies, and it's kind of also you see like generational, right? So when you're not growing up in the U.S., but then your next generation grows up here, then these allergies start arising more and more. And part of it could be the way that we're exposed to different skin products, like you mentioned. Another one is like the fact that actually we don't expose our kids to the food orally early enough, right? So this idea that you actually should give your kids nuts when they're really, really young. And so the immune system now recognizes that as food rather than something foreign.
Right,
Uh,
right, right. The first, you can imagine, right? The first interaction of the body with a substance, depending on how it gets in. Yeah, if it goes in your mouth, it might say, okay, well, this must be food. And obviously, the immune system is plastic; it develops, it needs to learn about things. Versus if it goes in through the skin, the body's assumption, I would think, is going to be, well, if it comes in from the outside world through the skin, it's probably a problem.
Exactly, yeah. So we because we were very interested in how microbes affect this as well. So one of the things we had found a few years ago is that Staphylococcus aureus, which I mentioned earlier in my talk with you, that bacteria is very common on humans, and actually it's coating the skin in skin diseases like atopic dermatitis or other itchy skin diseases. So and it's known that, kids who develop peanut allergies, actually, there's a correlation between Staph aureus on their skin and peanut allergy development. So we're asking, can these bacteria, if you mix them in with these food allergens, could it trigger this skin allergic response, which then leads to gut, like skin to gut axis,
Right.
and whether nerves are part of that as well. So we had found that Staph aureus can secrete a molecule called V8 protease, which stimulates itch fibers. And then the itch fibers, once they're activated, then you scratch, right? So the bacteria actually may, again, use this in some way for its advantage to help spread, but it induces this itchy response. So if we block the itch, does that also block the ability of Staph aureus to induce this bystander allergy response? So this is one of the projects we're working on right now in the lab.
Yeah. So we've touched on a couple important things here that have to do with what causes immune reactions to go awry or become
Mhm.
problematic. One key dimension here is when things happen.
Mhm.
Obviously, hopefully, it's pretty intuitive for people. When things happen earlier in life or fail to happen early in life, the immune system might not be trained properly. It might mislearn or inappropriately learn something. So that's why early life is important, right? It takes time for the immune system to learn and to develop and to recognize, self versus non-self, pathogen versus food, and so on and so forth. The other dimension here that we mentioned that's important is the spatial component, where things are
Mhm.
happening. If something
Mhm.
comes in through the mouth, the body's going to be predisposed or maybe make certain assumptions about it. They're going to be different than if it comes in through the skin. So when you're exposing someone through the skin versus through the GI tract, earlier versus later in development, all of these things are going to matter in terms of the immune system response and how the immune system gets trained to recognize and respond to things. The next thing I want to ask you more about is this sort of concept of chronic inflammation or inappropriate inflammation when inflammatory responses don't resolve properly. It's
Mhm.
something I've discussed on the podcast before in the context of things like dietary lipids, like the omega 6s and omega 3s, and the balance
Mhm.
between them, and how this can affect how long an inflammatory response lasts and make it maybe last a little bit too long if there's an imbalance there. Even though you wanted some inflammation for a while, you also want it to turn off when it's no longer needed. When we start thinking about things like chronic inflammatory conditions, autoimmune conditions, things that have to do with this failure of inflammation resolution, what can you start to talk about there from your own lab or from stuff you're familiar with in terms of how this actually happens or what's causing the failure of inflammation to resolve? I mean,
Yeah, this is a really key question in immunology, right? So why are chronic inflammatory diseases, actually rising in society? And also, how do we solve that, right? I think there's also many factors that could influence chronic inflammation. One, there's this thing called inflammaging. So aging itself, you were talking about you're young versus old. Well, the old immune system may actually be more susceptible to inducing certain types of chronic inflammation. And that could then contribute to many diseases, including brain diseases, like we think about Alzheimer's disease or also chronic pain, like pain. So too much inflammation will contribute to damage to multiple organs. So we are trying to also understand, I guess the wrinkle in there is, do peripheral nerves also play a role, right? Because um, neurons are unlike immune cells, they last you your lifetime, right? So they're not usually replaced. There are exceptions. There are parts in the hippocampus that get replaced, but these neurons that reside in our peripheral nerves actually last our lifetime. So could there be aspects of how they change that then also drive our chronic inflammation, right? So maybe they're not you said we talked about sensitization earlier, right? Maybe they're rewired in a way uh, due to injury or due to some other factor, right? That then causes that immune response to be overactive. I told you earlier about the flu example, for example, where
right.
we need nerves in our lung to control actually too much inflammation, right? So is it possible, as an example, that the nerves in the lung are not acting the way they should, and then you get like chronic lung inflammatory diseases, right? Um, so there's a big interest in this because certain branches of the peripheral nervous system have especially been linked to modulating chronic inflammation. One particularly is the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve I mentioned connects the gut to the brain, but also multiple other organs. It includes the lungs, the heart. A lot of our internal organs are connected to the brain via the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is it's called the vagus nerve because it's a wandering nerve. It innervates so many parts of our internal organs. And what scientists have found that if you activate the vagus nerve, it actually has a very potent anti-inflammatory effect on people were first, Dr. Kevin Tracy, it was one of the first in New York to find that vagus nerve stimulation can suppress inflammation during sepsis, which is a big inflammatory condition. But now many scientists are trying to understand how this works, right? So it's possible that the vagus nerve and its dysfunction could lead to chronic inflammation as well.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, the vagus nerve is talking to basically all of the organs in our body. And as you said, I had Kevin Tracy on, and I encourage people to go listen to that episode because I think it goes with this one quite nicely. But on the one hand, it's like this remarkable result. You basically just stimulate the vagus nerve non-specifically, and you kind of just shut down inflammation, let's say. But there's probably a lot of fine tuning there that can happen. And of course, it's not at all clear, exactly how this is happening. Like, why would just fairly generic stimulation of the vagus nerve just kind of shut down inflammation? And what is actually going on there in terms of the mechanics? And as you're saying, like, presumably there's some kind of code, right? Like different parts of the vagus nerve probably fire in different patterns, probably to turn up and down inflammation in complex ways.
Yes, yeah. So that's almost certainly the case. So I mentioned earlier that sensory neurons are highly diverse in the skin. Well, the vagus nerve, there's dozens of types of sensory neurons, and this is just looking at the molecules that they express. They're not only anatomicals, some are innervating different organs, but some are clearly expressing different receptors for immune factors. Like, for example, one type of vagal neuron might express the receptor for TNF alpha, which is a cytokine, and another one express one for IL-10. So actually, there was recently a really beautiful paper from another very well-known neuroscientist, Charles Zucker, who he's actually the one who discovered all the taste receptors. But he's now interested in the vagus nerve, and he found that if you activated one type of vagal neuron, that will induce one change in the immune system, very specific change in the immune system. For example, shutting down TNF production. And then another one, if you simulate that, will actually induce IL-10, which is this immunosuppressive cytokine. So he's only focused so far on those two, but there are probably multiple other vagus nerve circuits that specifically talk to a certain branch of the immune system or a certain type of inflammatory response. And it all goes through the brain. So the vagus nerve synapses in the brainstem from the body. And then in brainstem, there are also regions of the brainstem, for example, the NTS and DMV. So these neurons then map to other regions of the brainstem, and then they signal back to the body. And that back to the body part, like you mentioned, is still being mapped. So what nerves actually take the signal back from the brain to the body, and how do they then control that very specific immune response, right? Like, how do you tell immune cells only to turn on one type of cytokine or shut down another one? Very mysterious, I think. And I want to kind of bring this to an even broader question. Is this body-brain axis with inflammation? There are theories that there might be very specific regions of the brain that are there just to encode inflammatory sensing. So part of the cortex called the insula region has been shown that they might capture memory of inflammation from the body. And then if you reactivate those neurons, it can actually recall the inflammatory response in the body. So it's amazing that you can store memory of something that happened, let's say in your gut.
Yeah.
And then you recall that, and then the gut immune response gets reactivated when you start.
Right. And just so people know, so the insula is basically a part of our brain on the side of our head, more or less, and it's got a map of our internal organs. It's sort of like a map of the internal body. And you're saying that part of the insula, at least, can retain a memory of maybe like a gut infection we once had or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And this was really work from Azia Rolls in Israel, who had a really interesting study where they found that, let's say, colitis, gut inflammation, can be encoded in insula. And then she used a different part of the body, like the peritoneal cavity, doing inflammation. And when she's activated nerves due to one type of inflammation, it caused that specific anatomical part to then have immune cells go in.
Hmm.
Later on, after the inflammation's gone, you can recall that just by
Yeah.
activating those
Yeah.
neurons.
So the brain can not only encode a memory of something like an infection, it can quite literally direct the immune system where to go. Go to that organ, but not that organ.
And that's the amazing thing about the brain, right? That the immune system really can't do, right? To really have a anatomical and kinetic specific, cellular specificity encoded by memory. Um, and I think that that is probably a place where neuroimmunology is, there's so much to understand there. Like, how is that memory, encoded, and at the cellular level, how do these nerves actually control the immune system very specifically in one site? Um, and similarly, we're interested in similarly whether the peripheral nervous system memory, so like I mentioned sensitization, right? That process that we usually think about as inducing increased pain, but maybe that's also a mechanism to store an immune memory, right? So because let's say our peripheral nerve that's still very sensitive, if you activate that, does that also affect the next immune response at that same site, right? Like so there's a logic to this that the nervous system may have an advantage, right? You can encode spatially and also long term a memory response. We know the immune system has memory too, right? So when you get reinfected with a virus, that same immune cell will, like the T cell or B cell, will then proliferate and respond. But that doesn't necessarily have, that may have the molecular specificity, but doesn't have that and spatial and or kinetic specificity that the nervous system can supply.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
I want to ask you a little bit about the connection between things like pain and itch. They're
sure.
distinct,
Yeah.
but they're also related. Maybe
Mhm.
one fun way to get you talking about this as a scientist who knows
Yeah.
this stuff well is we're all familiar with pain and itch on our skin from experience. We've all gotten mosquito bites. We've all had rashes or contact dermatitis or whatever. We've all had bumps and bruises. When I was a child, and I think a lot of people experience this, I was always told, don't itch the rash, don't itch the mosquito bite because it'll spread it. And yet
Mhm.
itch seems to be, in an ecological sense, right? It's kind of like a behavioral impulse to remove something noxious from the skin. So let me ask you this. If you get an itch, like a full itch, maybe I've got poison ivy or I got an infection or a mosquito bite, but I'm really itchy somewhere on my body. What's the appropriate action to take? And what is it really doing?
I mean, I think this is a great question. So why do we itch, right? So that's the I think pain is a little bit more intuitive, right? You avoid injuring that site, right? Or you avoid being exposed again to that hot. You avoid a fire, right? You avoid the source of danger. But itch, you're actually scratching. So how is scratching protective? Well, there's different theories, right? So one is this idea of back, way back when we were living in the jungle or forest, and you get something on your skin, including insects or parasites, that this itching would remove that. And there is also this phenomenon called mirror itch. So when you think about itching or you see somebody scratching, you also start scratching. So again, it could be like a protective behavior as a herd that you remove things that are bad on your
Yeah,
skin.
yeah,
But there's a counter argument to that in the sense that, as you know, with a mosquito bite, you're itching way after the mosquito has left you, right?
right,
It
right.
bit you probably, minutes or even hour before, and now the thing is becoming. So then why do you scratch? Like, how is scratching even helpful? Well, so actually one of my close friends and collaborators, Dan Kaplan at University of Pittsburgh, has been studying potentially an idea that itching is actually therefore inducing an immune response. So
Mm.
when you scratch, right, we just talked about earlier, it induces a rash, it
Ah,
induces inflammation, right?
it's almost like an adjuvant or something. It's like you're causing the immune response to be even stronger by actually agitating the surface of the skin.
Exactly. And especially for if you want to induce a certain type of immune response, like for example, an allergic immune response, right? So maybe, and there is a theory that for things like injected into you, like venoms, that an allergic immune response actually helps wall off that venom or helps remove that thing. that, let's say, the mosquito has injected. So if you can induce that by scratching, maybe locally in the skin where the mosquito has bitten you, there would be a protective response, right? So this is all very theoretical, and we're all trying to understand that. But that could also be why I mentioned earlier, when you get a food allergen going through the skin and you're scratching, that then induces the allergy response, which is not protective for you, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but I also want to point out that other than, scratching and itch, just like with pain, there's very complex mechanisms by which itch occurs. Like you have different nerve types that cause itch, and they respond to different what's called pruritogens, things that can activate an itch fiber. There's at least three different types of itch fibers, and so how they're all activated and what they're doing is potentially different. But there is also, like you mentioned earlier about pain, there's adaptive itch, but also maladaptive itch. So there's chronic itch, right?
Yeah.
So there are people who have itchy conditions that don't go away. There are like many skin diseases, for example, like I mentioned atopic dermatitis, which is probably one of the most common ones, but there's also other ones like prurigo nodularis, and there's ones that are there's even idiopathic itch, which is unknown origin, where people just keep scratching and it's very hard to treat that because we don't yet understand what is triggering that and how to address it, right? So there's conditions where shutting that down, I mean, to be honest, people who have those conditions are miserable, right? That could be even worse than chronic pain, where you're
Hmm.
just constantly wanting to scratch and you can't relieve that itch.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so I think I did want to point out the differences also between pain and itch. So it used to be, let's say a decade ago, thought that itch was just a subset of pain, where like maybe itch is like where there's a lower amount of tickling of the same nerves that cause pain, and that's why you get an itch. But now it's very clear there are devoted nerves to each of these type
Yeah.
of
It's a
sensations. So
distinct type of sensation.
yes, and so the itch fibers have different receptors on them than pain fibers. So you mentioned prostaglandins earlier. So prostaglandins we know causes pain, right? Because prostaglandin receptors are in many of these nociceptors. For itch fibers, we had found and others that this other lipid called leukotrienes,
Hmm.
cysteine leukotriene, leukotriene
Wow.
C4, there's a receptor specifically on itch fibers, and this
Yeah.
leukotriene is activated during allergies.
Oh, wow. And just so people know, so again, prostaglandins, inflammatory lipids, leukotrienes are different, but they're actually also omega-6 polyunsaturated fat
Yes,
derived immune molecules.
exactly. That's right. So I think the lipids are really important for both pain and itch.
Right.
Um, but they cause different sensations. So we know, and logically, again, if there's a logic to why these two systems are talking to each other. So during allergies, you want to itch, whereas during, tissue injury, you want pain. So the mediators that are produced by immune cells, many of these lipids are produced by immune cells, are produced in different contexts. And
Yeah.
so you have itchiness in one condition versus pain in another condition. And then the resolution modulators are also a hot topic, like what could resolve itch or pain, right?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
yeah. Uh,
Interesting. I want to ask you a little bit more about things like mast cells, histamine,
mhm.
itching, and allergies. So I feel like I don't know how much of this is just me reading more about this stuff and noticing it more versus it actually changing in people's lives. But I had seasonal allergies as a kid. Antihistamines definitely were effective for me. Antihistamines, if I take them preemptively, will definitely prevent me from having the cold-like reaction, the snot, the sneezing, and stuff. They also seem to affect things like itch, which
Mhm.
hopefully that starts to make sense for people now. When we think about things like chronic inflammatory conditions, autoimmunity, I'm hearing more, it seems, about things like mast cell disorders, histamine sensitivity, and so forth. Can you give us a sense for allergic responses, autoimmunity, especially as they relate to mast cells and histamine? Are these things going up? And is this like an area of is this a hot topic right now in neuroimmunology at all?
Yeah, so the mast cell nerve interaction is really intimate. In fact, if you look in most tissues, where you find a mast cell, you'll find a nerve next to it. So they've somehow co-evolved in some way. And so one is through it for the reason of itch, right? So like you mentioned, histamine is one of the key things that mast cells make. And many of these nerves have histamine receptors, right? So when you activate these mast cells, then they start firing and you get this itch sensation. Mast cells are also chock full of cytokines and also
Right, right.
proteases
So
that,
can we think of like
yeah,
mast cells? They're basically a type of immune cell, and they're filled with these big bags, these big
yeah,
vesicles,
yeah.
and they can just dump a lot of histamine, cytokines, etc. So it's like a big bucket gets dumped when something stimulates a mast cell.
Yeah, exactly. And they're very powerful, right? They're few in number, but they are extremely powerful in inducing inflammation and inducing the downstream immune response. So yes, there are definitely more and more interest in mast cells beyond just allergies. I mean, I think like you mentioned, autoimmune diseases, many inflammatory conditions, mast cells, there's hints that they play a role.
Mhm.
One of the things I mentioned earlier, though, is the really interesting thing where the nerves can also activate the mast cells. So it's not just, so the nerves could still be part of that equation, right? So they release this, I mentioned neuropeptide called substance P, and substance
Yeah,
P that induces a mast cell to degranulate.
yeah,
So classically in allergies, you have antibodies like IgE, which is induced against, for example, the peanut, right? Then
yeah,
that's on the mast cell. And then when a peanut antigen comes in, it activates the mast cell. So that's classic antibody-driven mast cell degranulation. But then there's also neurogenic mast cell degranulation, which I mentioned is the nerves can also, independent of antibodies, induce the mast cell to release their contents. And so there's still a question of, are these, when you're activated by one thing or the other, do mast cells release the same things or do they release different things? And that's very important because what they release could affect the downstream immune response very strongly, right?
yeah,
So, and then could we block some of these pathways to
yeah,
block mast cells from going awry?
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I wanna step back for a minute and ask you kind of a general question. So we know that various forms of autoimmunity, allergies, chronic inflammation have been on the rise. A lot of people experience these things chronically, all the time, basically. One way that people often respond to having such an issue is they might start taking antihistamines like Zyrtec every day, just as a preemptive measure. They might start taking NSAIDs every day just because, they just get in the habit of it. It does help. It can help, at least in the right circumstance. Is there any, and so there's a difference between treating the symptoms, treating, the end result of the inflammation, the pain you might feel, the allergic, stuffy nose response that you might have to an allergy to something. But there's a difference between that and understanding the cause of that and
mhm.
the cause of the inappropriateness of it. Maybe it's the balance of fatty acids in your diet affecting how inflamed you get when you get an injury. Maybe it's not understanding that you've got a food allergy and you keep eating something that's stimulating an immune response, but you just don't realize it because it's not so striking that you notice, like, oh, hey, I must be allergic to peanuts or whatever. Um, is there anything you want to say or any downsides to chronically treating these immune responses, these inflammatory responses with things like NSAIDs or antihistamines day by day, week by week?
Yes, I think this is a very good question because many people take these without, they no side effects, right? They're in their mind. But you mentioned earlier one thing, right? Inflammation is there for a reason, right? So you need to have inflammation go in this way where it goes up after tissue injury and then goes away. So there was a really interesting study from a group in Montreal where they were a pain lab. This is Luda Diachenko's lab, where they were thinking, okay, well, chronic pain, what we just talked about, right, is something that occurs in many people. But what's the difference between somebody who gets it or not? And one of the striking things, which again, very surprising, was the use of NSAIDs during the injury. So people who used NSAIDs, I don't, to be honest, I don't remember exactly what kind of injury they were looking at, but they developed chronic pain more than people who didn't use NSAIDs. So meaning that they were acutely blocking their pain, but maybe that inflammatory response caused by prostaglandins was required for proper tissue healing.
Right,
So
right,
then
right,
long term, they actually got worse pain because they
right.
use NSAIDs, right?
Yeah. And
So that
again,
just,
like
yeah.
people should probably remember here, there's a whole pattern and chain of events that needs to play out. Like the start of the cleanup and the wound healing and the rejuvenation is literally tied to the inflammation part of this. So like there's a sequence of things that should be happening, and if you block one part of the sequence because it makes you more comfortable, it might make you more comfortable, but you might also be blocking the next steps that is actually going to be part of what we would call the healing side of it.
Yes, yes. And I wanted to also bring up more related to my research, right? So I mentioned to you that these nociceptors play such an important role in talking to different cell types, whether in the gut, they talk to goblet cells to make mucus, or they talk to immune cells to shut down their, and one of the, mediators is CGRP, right? So I personally think there are lots of people taking CGRP medications now for migraine, like long term. They're taking
Yeah.
it prophylactically, but that has an effect outside of migraine that I think one of the side effects that people already know is it affects the
Yeah.
gut. There's
And remind
constipation.
us, are these medications blocking CGRP? CGRP is causing the migraine, is the idea?
Yes, yes. So
Yeah.
they're blocking either the neuropeptide itself, they're antibodies that neutralize CGRP, or they're small molecules that block the receptor for
Yeah.
CGRP. And there are now millions of people on these drugs worldwide. So I would think that that will, in some cases, dysregulate things in the gut, or in other cases in wound healing. Like I mentioned, there was this Nature paper that showed that if you don't have CGRP and you have a skin wound, it doesn't heal as well.
Wow.
So
Wow.
there are
And
things like
yeah, and
that.
that's,
Yeah.
that's sort of insidious too, because you can imagine someone suffers from migraines and migraines suck. So they take a drug that blocks CRP and it helps with their migraines. But are they going to notice if their cuts heal 20% slower? Probably not.
Exactly. And I think they're being touted by the headache field as like a miracle drug because there's no side effects. But I think that we'll see. You will see what happens long term. The other thing is many of these, so I talk about neuroimmune interactions, right? There's so many people on different neuro modulators, right? It could be, well, for pain, definitely things like opioids, right? And these things have effects beyond just pain. I think
Right.
they will dysregulate your immune response, or have effects on other systems, even like the gut. The microbiome gets dysregulated when you're taking. So these kind of things where, again, the neurologists are thinking mostly, okay, well, we're going to give this SSRI to treat depression, but that could be affecting our gut and other
Yeah.
things where
Yeah.
they're not, I think these things need to be better, more systematically studied.
Yeah. Yeah. And it kind of goes back to the thing that we touched on at the very beginning where, our minds like to compartmentalize things and categorize things and divide things, but there's often blurry lines between all this stuff. In some sense, basically everything's pleiotropic, everything's multifunctional. There's not The endorphins aren't just pain peptides and pain molecules. They do a bunch of other stuff. Serotonin's not just a mood molecule. It's going to affect your gut and a bunch of other things.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that biology is that your your baby? Okay.
That's actually the cat. You can
Oh, the
ignore
cat. Okay,
that.
sorry. Yeah, so I think it's a sobering point, right, to realize that every system is connected, and the brain especially to every system, right? So understanding how these affect other systems is something that doctors need to think more about. However, on the other side, I think that it's also exciting because if some of these same, you know, modulators of, let's say, neuroimmune communication can be harnessed to treat disease. I'll give you one example where there's kind of an exploding area, which is neuroimmune interactions in cancer. So CGRP again. CGRP, as an example, has been shown to be activated in cancers. And in some cases, the tumor cells cause the CGRP to be released.
Yeah.
And again, it's like the bacteria I showed you earlier. They talked about it hijacks this system because then that
Right.
CGRP shuts down the protective immune cells and
Yeah.
kind of polarizes more of a wound healing response, but tumors are kind of like a wound that doesn't heal, right? It's just keep going. So people are actually targeting CGRP to think about treating things like stomach cancer right now.
Yeah.
So,
So again, the idea is whether it's a pathogen like a bacteria or a cancer, ordinarily in a healthy state, the immune system would come in and get rid of those things. CGRP is basically turning down an immune response. It's preventing immune cells from coming in. So by hijacking that system, turning up CGRP, a pathogen or a cancer cell can protect itself.
yes, yeah, exactly. You got it right. So, and this extends beyond the pain system. There are people looking at stress signaling, right? Why do people who are stressed out have a, dampened immune system? Because a lot of those molecules at the sympathetic nerves, like adrenaline or cortisol, they're there to shut down. I mean, acutely, this might be a good thing, but chronically, it's really bad. And so in cancer, that's one of the things that people are really looking into. If we block adrenergic signaling, can that increase the immune response against tumors? So, I think we need to understand this brain body or brain immune body interaction better, because in some conditions, like you mentioned, like chronic diseases, this could be the culprit, right? But in other conditions, it may actually lead to new treatments for
Yeah.
diseases that are like cancer and
Yeah.
other things.
Yeah. And just to kind of riff a little bit more on this theme of bidirectional communication, balance, trade-offs, pleiotropy, all of that stuff. You mentioned two examples with CGRP where something bad happens. A pathogen
Hmm.
or a cancer cell can hijack CGRP, turn up the CGRP signal to basically prevent itself. So, something like necrotizing fasciitis, or something like cancer, these are bad things you don't want, an infection
Hmm.
and cancer. And higher CGRP can prevent your immune system from handling the problem. So, CGRP high, immune system low, bad outcome. Are there potentially therapeutic applications to elevating CGRP where maybe you've got a chronic autoimmune or inflammatory condition and you
Hmm.
want that CGRP to turn up, or excuse me, to turn down, so the immune system can, or you want it to go up so the immune system can turn off properly?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So that's exactly the case that I mentioned earlier, wound healing, right? So that's one place where it could accelerate. So that paper, the Nature paper I mentioned, they also made a synthetic, longer lasting CGRP that they put on wounds, and it actually accelerated wound healing, right? So that's one place. For autoimmune diseases, that's something of interest. We did find, also this role of CGRP and the immune response is context dependent too. So in the gut, I mentioned that it makes mucus, right? So if you actually don't have CGRP, the gut is much more susceptible to colitis, which is inflammatory condition, and
Mhm.
also more susceptible to infection, because what happens is we looked at salmonella infection. The CGRP also maintains the balance of the microbiome. So then if you don't have that, then the salmonella gets in more. So you need it there in some conditions to really, really facilitate wound healing and also fighting infection. In the gut, we haven't thought about like giving more of it, but that could be one thing to shut down or to cure some of these diseases. So I agree with you that harnessing that system and upping it in certain conditions could actually be protective.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. And when we think about peptides more generally, especially because peptides are becoming very popular, more and more people are using exogenous peptides that they're injecting into their body for various reasons. They're becoming interested in this. On just the general theme of peptides, on context dependent and context appropriate responses, not too much, not too little. What would you say to people around peptides and experimenting with them in terms of how they should think about regulating their use and think about acute versus chronic use and things like
hmm,
that? Because it sounds like a general theme with this stuff is right context dependence. You want to use not too much but not too little. You want to use it in
yeah.
the appropriate context but not in
Hmm.
other contexts. So these things are probably not something you just want to use in a haphazard fashion all the time.
I agree. You'll have to educate me on what peptides are now being used in the market. But generally, I would say, it should be rigorously studied by the FDA and by scientists, right? Because like you said, too much of a good thing is actually could be really harmful. And, our body uses these for different physiological and immune purposes. So if you're supplementing it just like anything, it could have really nasty side effects. And can you give me an example of, for example, like actually what are people using peptides?
Oh, I mean, well,
Uh,
there's a bunch. I mean, obviously, you've got the various GLP-1 drugs, which are out there being
yes.
used for weight loss
Yeah.
and metabolism. The last episode I did was with someone who studies a mitochondrial peptide called MOTS-C. People are using this for its metabolic effects and its
Hmm.
sort of
Hmm.
exercise-related effects. There are ones that affect the immune system that are people, that are using for inflammation purposes, things like KPV. There are other ones. I mean, there's a whole list we could talk about, but people are using them more and more. And
Yeah.
yeah, there's a whole list of them.
Yeah, I mean you're right. I forgot about the GLP. That's that. I mean, I wonder how society, how health will be changed right
Yeah.
down the
Well, it's
line, I
it's.
think.
I mean, that's like it's kind of like what you said before, where obviously a lot of people are using the GLPs and they're going to continue using them. What's interesting to me and potentially concerning is it's like what we talked about before, where you can have an acute benefit to something like an NSAID, and then there can be a chronic problem that's not obvious or not clear to detect right away, and you don't
Hmm.
even recognize it as a side effect because hey, if my wound healing is compromised by 10 or 20%, I'm probably not going to notice that, but I am going to notice that I'm in less pain when I bump my knee. If someone's
Hmm.
taking a GLP-1 for months, years,
Hmm.
decades,
Hmm.
what effects is that going to have beyond the obvious acute effect? And there's probably going to be a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that um I mean, yeah, the GLP-1, there should be more, studies on the, every system, right? And what's going on in these patients who get years of treatment. Um, but I mean, I think at least GLP-1 has been rigorously clinical trialed. I think it's really important that people not just take the news of, oh, this one thing does one thing, right? Like I think trusting that um but then again, CGRP antagonists are in the same group, right? So I think that as a point, like we should be very, very careful, and understand that every system is connected to each other. So there could definitely be drawbacks to everything. So yeah, I mean, I think chronic pain is one of these areas where there's a huge clinical need, right? We need to find ways of dampening chronic pain, and there's people want more specificity, right? So I think that's one of the things is there if there's a way to target just nociceptors and not other cells in the body, right? Maybe that would be better than opioids, which have all these effects on all, reward systems and other places in the CNS. But also, I think, to your point, if you can find a way that doesn't take away the beneficial roles of these systems, right? But shuts down the overactive aspects of it, then
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the way to go in the future, right?
Yeah.
Rather than just cutting something completely off or activating it to a huge
Yeah.
extent that it's not physiological.
Yeah. And just to kind of ask it one more time in a slightly different way, when people are interfacing with various immune modulators, whether we're talking about NSAIDs, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, ibuprofen, aspirin, things like this, or we're talking about antihistamines, Zyrtec,
Hmm.
allergy
Hmm.
medication. I'm guessing you would say it's probably not a good idea to be taking these things all of the time, every day, but to be taking them in a more context appropriate fashion, like
Hmm.
only
Hmm.
when you really think you need them, rather than getting in the habit of using them all the time. Even if it sort of seems completely innocuous, it probably isn't.
I agree. I agree. I think that if it was a severe medical condition where you need to take it all the time, then follow your doctor, right? But I like what I'm hearing you're saying is like these are over-the-counter drugs, and people might think, oh, I need to block my chronic inflammation, so I'm just going to take an NSAID every day. I think that's a bad idea. I think if you don't need it, I mean, pharmacology can do things. Not everything is also highly specific, right? You think yes, they're supposed to do this one thing, but drugs have other effects. And I think it's just not good for us to kind of unknowingly going in and doing things because it seems like it's harmless.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. What are some projects in the lab right now or questions you're working on that you're really excited about? in terms of neuroimmune interactions and the things we've discussed that you think we're going to see some interesting and exciting results in the next 1 or 2 years?
Oh, thank you. I have a lot of interesting things going on in my lab. Related to chronic pain, one of the areas we're interested in is how infections might induce chronic pain. So, as an example, we're looking at Lyme disease right now. Lyme disease, as you may know, is a tick-borne bacterial pathogen, which a lot of people suffer from long-term effects of Lyme disease. So, some people, most people, you get treated with antibiotics and then the symptoms go away. But there's about 10 to 20% of patients who have this chronic, a lot of times neurological issues, fatigue, pain, as well as neuropathy. So we have found that we think at least part of the mechanism is through immune cells. So these bacteria actually cause a long-term immune response, which doesn't resolve, like you were just talking about, resolution of inflammation. So we have a study that we're really excited about is understanding what causes these immune cells, and they actually accumulate in the nerves that cause pain. And so why are they there and how do we shut them down? So that's one of the exciting projects we're working on. And let me think about other ones. My lab is also starting to get more into not just pain, but also neurodegenerative diseases. So we're interested in Alzheimer's disease and also in ALS and frontotemporal dementia. So we have a specific interest in molecules and neurons that are actually related to the immune system. So again, this kind of separation of what we think about what is a neuron, what is an immune cell, but neurons also harbor innate immune receptors. So receptors inside their cell that need to protect them from viruses. So we're interested in whether some of these pathways that the neuron needs, because every cell needs to be protected from viruses, are activated in the wrong way during neurodegenerative diseases. Like, so those proteins that cause neurodegeneration, are they activating what the neuron thinks is the virus? And then that eventually leads to the neurons to die and degenerate. So we're very interested in that area.
Are there any final thoughts you want to leave people with, or anything you want to reiterate from our discussion today, just on the general subject of neuroimmune interactions?
Yeah, I think that if people can take away the idea that these two systems are really intimately connected and that there's powerful effects of each one on the other. And I think one of the most exciting points to take away is that in the future, if we understand some of these neuroimmune interactions, we might be able to really harness it to treat disease. So that includes blocking harmful immune molecules to treat chronic pain, or actually activating or inducing neural responses to shut down the immune system in autoimmune diseases, or to ramp it up in, let's say, cancer and things like that. So I think the potential of understanding how these systems talk to each other is tremendous in terms of finding new treatments for disease.
All right. Well, Professor Isaac Chiu, thank you very much for your time. This is very, very interesting research that you do, and I love learning about it. So hopefully I can check back in a couple of years and see what else you've discovered.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's been my pleasure to be here, and thank you.
A great way to support my efforts is to visit my support page at mindandmatter.substack.com. A link to that page is in the episode description, or you can search for it on the Substack page itself. The support page has an up-to-date list of my affiliate partners. These are companies I work with, and if you buy those products through those links or using the discount codes provided, those will get you a great deal on a variety of products related to optimizing physical, metabolic, or mental health and vitality. These are all products I use myself, and some of them are directly related to podcast episodes or formulated by Mind and Matter guests. For example, there's a great product called Keto Citra, formulated by a kidney biologist who is on episode number 186. It contains the ketone body BHB together with several minerals in a precise ratio, formulated with kidney health in mind. There are also links to products like physical technology devices to track your metabolic health, digital applications to help you find and learn about food and consumer products, and more. One product I use every day is the AquaTrue water filter. I recommend this to to everyone because it gets everything out of your drinking water. Heavy metals, microbes, endocrine disruptors, microplastics, you name it. Other charcoal or gravity-based filters that a lot of people use don't get everything out. They just get some of the stuff out. So I really like the AquaTrue product. You can look for a link to my affiliate partners on my support page or directly in the episode description to this episode, or you can go to mindandmatter.substack.com to find it there.